topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Alise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, now on air for 8.5 years. Thanks for tuning in again this week. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. If we've not met yet, I'm a management consultant, organizational logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Alise Cortez and Associates help companies enliven their operations by articulating their purpose and building inspirational leaders and cultures activated by meaning and purpose to turn those companies from a flatline EKG to a vibrant workplace. There, people are intrinsically motivated to perform at their best, grow into their full potential, and are committed to stay and help deliver on the company's mission. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at alisecortez.com. Now, getting into today's program, with us today are the authors of The Empathy Advantage, Leading the Empowered Workforce. We have Heather McGowan, a future of work strategist, thought leader, researcher, and author, and a leading voice on the future of work. She's transforming mindsets and entire organizations around the globe with her message about how the next phase of work will focus on continuous learning and how leadership must shift to guide these expeditions. Also with us is Chris Shipley, who has documented, influenced, and predicted the impact of technology on business and society for more than 30 years. Today, she focuses her work on the human and organizational challenges in the face of technology and economically driven disruption. Heather and Chris, welcome to Working on Purpose. It's amazing to have you on.
It's great to be here.
I want to show and just show off this beautiful work. Look at this thing. It is just gorgeous. I do find it remarkable. And Chris, you know, we're talking about, having children. What you did here is actually harder than bringing a child into the world, just so you know, because I have done both. Really, really amazing work. So you're welcome. You're so welcome. As I said, I'm a huge fan of what you've done, and I align so much with your message. So I want to get into you. There's so much in your book that we could cover here, but I really want to talk and start by talking about just how radically the workforce has changed, and I align with that terrifically. And you really talk about how the why, where, and how we work has changed forever, and that work is almost unrecognizable. And I find that really interesting. You also talk about the different backgrounds, the different generations, 5 generations now in the workplace. And you talk about how increasingly leaders who resist this new way of being will be the ones that struggle. So could you just start by giving us just a little bit of perspective on how what's happened here in just in the last few years has radically changed the workplace?
Sure. What happened is, nobody seems to want to talk about the pandemic when I go out and give talks, which is my primary method of earning a living. People say to me, yeah, but don't talk about the pandemic. And I think, no, actually, I think we do need to talk about the pandemic. What happened is we had about 1,000 days of a forced social experiment. And it caused us to see the fragility of life, the finiteness of time. And the time at home and with our loved ones or in isolation had us, for folks who live alone, had us thinking, is this really what I'm doing with my life? And so when people started asking me initially to give talks on remote work, I said, sure, I can pull something together for that, no doubt. But I think we're missing the bigger picture. It's not just where we work, but it's where work fits in our lives that I think is the bigger discussion. And it brought up 5 questions. Who works? The workplace was designed for a single profile, and that's largely a white straight man who had a wife at home to manage all the caregiving responsibilities. What we do for work, we still train people largely to do routine and predictable tasks, even at high cognitive loads. How we work, we train people mostly to work in isolation. We hire people into singular jobs when increasingly we're going to work in collaboration. And then the why we work is what really bubbled to the surface. So it's the existential crisis, it's labor shortages that will continue unabated for decades, And it's the entrance of Gen Z into the workplace who is not going to compromise in the way prior generations have in terms of what they'll put up with or what's worth it for them in the workforce. So collectively, that gives you an empowered workforce that wants to work with a sense of purpose. And if you know how to engage them, there's never been a more exciting time. But if you're trying to use the methods and structures of the past, you're unprepared.
Mm-hmm. There's just so much quotable material in your book, ladies, just really so much. And one of the things that I also really found really intriguing was when you talk about, of course, the pandemic, you say that plagues reorder society, and you say they are in an existential crisis from which survivors emerge fundamentally changed. Then you go on, you talked about in the 1300s, we had the bubonic plague, which gave way to the Renaissance. The 1918 influenza pandemic sparked the Roaring '20s. And then you say the COVID-19 has given us the Great Resignation, which is a reckoning that started in America, and it has catalyzed significant and rapid economic transformation of the workforce since the greatest since the rise of the Industrial Revolution. I think that is so critical to situate that, because I think, and that's what I try to do in my book too, is to really help leaders recognize, look, the world is profoundly, fundamentally, and irrevocably changed. And I think the way that you did that for us is just really dynamic.
Chris, you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it's important to recognize, though, that the pandemic amplified so many of these things that were already trend lines. We were already experiencing a lot of these behaviors, a lot of these concerns and trends. We put a magnifying glass on it all. And I think that to the point that Heather just made, what got us to that point in 2020 and the sort of rethinking that went on for the next 1,000 days, the conclusion really is that you can't go back. You got to. What got you here isn't going to get you where you're going in the future, and it is a great opportunity to really rethink everything about your work environment.
Yes, and I really appreciate that. And then you go on to talk about how there's this massive study of 30,000 people in 31 countries. Microsoft's latest work trends index found that many of the things workers were accepting in 2019, they just simply won't anymore. Things like the commute, the cost of childcare were no longer worth it. Then you'll also go on and talk about just how the push for productivity is driving workers to exhaustion. So this burnout stuff is real. Gen Zs are especially at risk for burnout. So I really thought that too, the way that you really depict just how the force of what has happened here over the last, whatever it's been, 50 some years, has come to a culmination that again requires some change. And I think that's worth speaking about too, if you would weigh in on that.
Yeah, and when folks ask me to, can give a talk on resilience, and I've put together talks on resilience, I say, you folks seem to want to go back to 2019. Let's look at how we were doing back then. We were burnt out then. We had mental distress then. We were disengaged then. We actually had a spike in trust, engagement, and productivity at the height of the pandemic. When we were washing our packages on the front porch, we had higher levels of trust and higher levels of productivity. Now we have lower levels of trust, especially trust in leadership, and lower levels of productivity. So let's look at that. What you had there in the height of the pandemic is you didn't have a choice. So you trusted your people. They had agency. You gave them autonomy, and they performed. Why don't we tap back into that? Because there's such a high correlation with employees that have autonomy. 79% of employees who have autonomy are actually engaged. Higher levels of trust, you have a multiple times higher levels of performance. High-performing teams, high-performing organizations are rooted in trust. So those are the kinds of things we got to get back to, and that's what I think the opportunity is with the empowered workforce, is figuring out how to activate them. You're not going to control them with the command and control stuff of the past. You've got to engage them with intrinsic motivation.
I completely agree, which is why I'm all about the meaning and purpose stuff. So I completely align with that. And that's one thing, Heather, you mentioned this, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper on it because it really does speak to something important and critical. And this notion of this shift from work from home and that autonomy and trust that you were talking about, it allowed workers, as you say, to find their agency. In other words, to be activated, to be awakened to what they could actually do. And in my view, that's so much of what's missing inside organizations is the capacity, creating an environment where people can be activated on that level.
Yeah, so I'm going to draw some pictures because there's pictures in the book, and that's how before the pandemic, we had a smaller circle that was called our personal life. And our personal life is frankly fodder for a eulogy, and we had agency over it. And we had a bigger circle for which the smaller circle was subordinated, which is our professional life, which is our fodder for our resume, CV, LinkedIn, what have you. And what happened during the pandemic is these two overlapped. The personal grew a little bit, the professional shrank a little bit, and we had agency and autonomy over both. And I think that was a moment in where people felt a sense of, I want to work with a sense of purpose. I have higher levels of engagement. I have higher levels of performance when I'm activated with a sense of self-expression and performance. And one of the things we saw between 2021 and 2022, 53% of people who left their jobs, according to Pew Research, went into a different industry or function or area. And I think that's really good news, because that's people saying, you know what, I always hated the financial sector. I love the travel agency, or I've always wanted to be a teacher, whatever it may be. They switch to find something that more aligns with their sense of purpose and is a sense of self-expression for them. So that's, I think, where we need to get to more often, is focusing on trust, focusing on purpose, focusing on self-expression, and focusing less on fixed jobs and having people attracted to your organization because they know they can learn faster with you than on their own. They know that they can express themselves fully at work with psychological safety, and they know they have trust. And when you give people that, it's better than any dollar you could ever give them.
Mm-hmm.
But let's also be really clear that the agency, bringing people back to the office, is not a way to quell their agency. You say, you're back now, I can watch you work, I can make you, attend meetings, and all of the things that, we've come to understand are the trappings of being in a workplace versus in a hybrid or even work from home environment. That agency still exists. People might be going into an office, but they're still in their minds thinking, is this what I want to be doing? Is this who I want to be doing it for? Is this the work that does give me purpose and meaning? And they may not be walking out or striking, but if you don't understand that agency is there and it will be used, you are going to lose people. You're going to lose them to underperformance. You're going to lose them to quiet quitting. You're going to lose them to other organizations or other opportunities, other industries where they feel that they are allowed to be a full person at work, and where their agency, where their full self is tapped, their intrinsic motivation is tapped in their work. And that, I think, is where you get this much higher level of performance, because people are now doing that which gives them a sense of purpose.
Yeah, and let me just jump in and say, clearly, we don't have a dog in the fight about where work takes place. I don't think we know. I think we've had 4 social experiments that taught us a bunch of things, but I don't think we know where we optimize human performance. It may be some in, some out, maybe all out for some, may all be all in for others. It really depends on the job, the task, the team, fairness. I speak virtually, like this would be a setup for a virtual talk, but I speak in person. I just got back from Vancouver. I'm going to Denver next week. So and I can see it from that perspective. There's a different experience from an in-person talk to a virtual talk.
Yep.
There are advantages to virtual ones because there are environments I can't get to, physically can't get there in time, or people don't have the budget to do it. So when we look at work, it's really, we got to figure out how we activate human performance. And we have to also have empathy for the leaders who are in place right now. Because the leaders in most organizations did not become leaders during the pandemic. They were leaders prior to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And they were successful in the arena of the office.
Right.
And that's what makes them comfortable. If they don't see people, they get nervous.
Right.
And so we have to have empathy for them, because they don't know how to manage a remote team or a hybrid team, because we haven't taught them yet, and we haven't figured that out yet. So we have to have empathy, when we call it the empathy advantage, all around, including for the leaders right now that are struggling. And we have to give them the tools they need to unleash that human performance.
Completely agree with that, Heather. And I love that you call your book The Empathy Advantage, because we do need to get empathy for that. And that's, again, why I do a lot of the work that I do. And I certainly, like you ladies, am out to try to help find that way forward for how do we actually well lead and manage the workforce of today and tomorrow, because it is radically different from yesterday. If we look at what you say in your book here, that, this is a pretty bleak picture currently, that Gallup says that from 2022, the global engagement survey found that just 21% percent of employees say that they're engaged at work, and only a third say that they were thriving in their overall well-being. In other words, we have a lot of work to do here.
We do, and when you take that even further and you look at our issues around burnout and mental health and mental distress, it's even more troubling, and isolation. So, and the interesting thing is a couple of surveys, 3 of them actually, came out emphasizing the role that both the job and the manager has on people's well-being. Mm-hmm. So 69% of people asked said that their boss was their greatest influence over their mental health, on par with their spouse or partner, and more than their doctor or therapist. 60% of folks in another survey said the job was the greatest factor affecting their mental health. And then a longitudinal study that looked at how managers affect caregiving. So if you are a manager, if you have a manager who gives you autonomy and gives you agency at work and trusts you, you go home and you're a warmer and more engaged parent. Yeah. And as a result, because this was a longitudinal study, your children have greater financial, academic, and social success. So we really need to arm these leaders, because the impact is not just the workplace and society, but it's the next generation and the next workforce.
Yes, completely aligned with that, Heather. I've been saying this ripple effect for quite some time, completely aligned. I want to come with you on your road trip, by the way, ladies. This is fantastic. Let's grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We were on the air with Heather McGowan and Chris Shipley. They are the authors of The Empathy Advantage, Leading the Empowered Workforce. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us, and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. As I'm dedicated to helping create a world where people realize their potential at work, are led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute to their greatness, and would do business that betters the world, I keep writing my own books. One of my latest came out in March of 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization: How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And it helps leaders understand what today's workforce really wants, and then offers 21 best practices to equip them to provide it through their leadership and culture. You learn more about my books at alisecortez.com and buy them on Amazon or wherever you find your favorite booksellers. If you're just now joining the program, my guests are Heather McGowan, a future of work strategist, thought leader, researcher, and author and leading voice on the future of work, and Chris Shipley, who focuses her work on the human and organizational challenges in the face of technology and economically driven disruption. So let's pick up where we were. Again, there's so many things we could talk about in your book that are so worth talking about. But one thing that I want to go to next, which I was really, really shaken by in your book, I did not know this at all, is you talk about, you say by 2019, the U.S. federal hourly minimum wage had been stuck at $7.25 for a decade. You say, had the minimum wage kept pace with inflation, hourly workers would be making $24 an hour. Had wages kept pace with productivity, the hourly rate would be $26, but wages didn't keep pace. And so I think about, gosh, this is incredible. No wonder we're having such an issue here. And we saw so many people leaving those jobs during the pandemic. But if you could comment a bit on this, how in the world could this possibly have happened?
Well, we had enough workers to fill those jobs so that we could continue to keep those wages compressed. And then we're seeing a labor shortage now, and what is effectively a collective strike. And we've seen, I think, a lot of places, it's nowhere near where it should be, but we're seeing wages in the $16, $17, $18 an hour. And there are some parts of the country where they're fighting for 15 as the federal minimum wage. We ought to be, given how long it takes us to win these fights, we ought to be fighting for 30 now. And because it's going to take a decade to get there, So I think some of the inflation we're experiencing will persist a bit because I don't think the wages are going to go back down, nor should they.
Yeah, but listen, the argument is always, well, we can't raise the minimum wage because it's going to affect small businesses, and small businesses won't be able to survive if they have to pay their employees a living wage. And so their employees work in a state of misery often at multiple jobs in order to just patch together a living, meaning they don't have the income to actually buy the goods and services of those small businesses. So there's this sort of specious argument that says if we pay people more, we'll go out of business. And a lot of that, I think, is just run around this idea that capitalism accrues value to the owners, and people are treated like cogs in a wheel, right? And I think that there's a fundamental awareness that labor is not valued as a human capacity, but as a resource, as an asset, as something to be used up. And I think this is what we go back to the discussion about agency. This is what people are understanding now. Wait a minute, I'm worth more than $7.25 or even $15 an hour. I'm not going to work in this role that doesn't honor the value I contribute. And I think we're approaching a tipping point where workers are going to just say, listen, it's not, you go fight all you want in DC. That's going to take 10 years. Heather's absolutely right. Or you can just recognize that for the good of your business and our economy generally, we need to reshift the balance and in our economy, in capitalism, and treat human beings like human beings, not as chattel labor that can simply be replaced, because we're just not in that place anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's only possible because of the labor shortages. If you have a labor surplus, you never win that argument. One of the other things that came up, and this was somewhere in the middle of the pandemic, one of Edelman Trust barometers found that customers were looking more and more at the brands they bought and how they treated their employees.
Yes.
So if you were right by your employees and keeping them safe during the pandemic and paying them fairly, or paying them not to work in industries that were shut down, people were more likely to trust and support those brands. So I saw that as a bright spot, because we either have to have the consumer push or we have to have a labor shortage. And then we had both. I see a little bit less on the consumer side, but the labor shortages continue.
Mm-hmm. So much there to be able to delve into. I talked a little bit about that in my book as well. But as a social scientist too, I really fascinated with all the trends that you surfaced here. And we've already talked about the where of work here, but what I want to get to next that I thought was really compelling about what you wrote, ladies, is you talk about how, of course, for so long we've centered our lives on our jobs. That's so true. Where we work determined, where we lived, where our kids went to school, with whom we socialized, all those kind of things. What I find fascinating, though, is what you then say is what's happened now is we want to build our lives around belonging and community. So we're settling our homes and our places to fulfill our physical and emotional needs, and then layering in our jobs. Working remotely or finding work that is more purpose aligned in the place we want to be. I find that incredibly compelling, that the way that you have written about that, this idea of, well, you mentioned that the circles before, Heather, but if you would speak a bit about this calling for belonging and community here.
Sure. So the circles you talk about, and I'm going to draw them in the air again. So first you had your job, wherever your job was located, that meant the geography in which you lived. And you built the layers around that from your spouse's job, most likely, because we're mostly two income families, where you bought your home, which was usually a school system and a real estate decision. And then out of that, you sort of accidentally got community and belonging. And now putting community and belonging at the center, and then the job on the outer edge. I say to companies all the time, because that's what I do all day long, I will argue we will make better value when work fits the right place in our lives. So when you get people who are not burnt out, and not lonely, and not exhausted, and enriched by their community, and thriving because of the environments that they're in, they'll bring that into the work that they do, especially when it's purpose aligned and it's self-expression.
Agreed. So one of the things I wrote about in my book is I live here close in East Dallas, and I have this big, huge bay window in my front living area. And during the pandemic, I literally saw moving caravans of reconnection. What I saw was the adults walking along, sipping on some kind of a beverage. The kids were happily rolling along on a bicycle or a skateboard or whatever, and the pets were happily coming along. And it was something I had never seen before. And it was magical.
Yeah, we had a collective pause button moment. My only concern right now is we seem to be losing many of the things we learned in that moment. If we looked at it, I don't want to delve into politics really, but we became more divided during this rather than united.
We did.
It's depressing to me. But we had moments of community in smaller scale, like in bigger scale in terms of how we vote and we see each other as other. I see more so on the community level, on the street level, and the neighborhood level, we saw a bit more cohesion, and I was hoping that it would be sort of a contagion that would grow from there. And that trust that we saw employees have with their people, I was expecting and hoping that to be a contagion as well. So one of our messages is one of my messages when I'm out there is, why are we not going back? Why are we missing the learning in this crisis?
Yeah, and so one of the pleasures we had in writing this book was talking to David Allison, who's written a book called Value Graphics. And he argues that marketers look at things like gender and age and income and zip code to figure out how to segment markets. But at the end of the day, no matter how you segment them, you'll reach about 10% with your message. But if you look at what people value, and he's interviewed 750,000 people around the world, you can very clearly understand what motivates people. And there are, it changes from region to region, what's top and bottom, but there are about 56, 58 values that people share around the world, regardless of culture and any of the demographic data. Interestingly, belonging is always in near the top of those lists, regardless of where you are in the world. I think what's happened is that if you recognize that belonging also taps into our very primal sense of tribalism, right? And so if I can belong to a community of people in Dallas who are willing to take their kids for a walk and have their nightly cocktails out on the street and wave and belong to this neighborhood going through this crisis together, that's a very sweet thing. I can also use belonging as a way to separate people by grievances. I can use belonging to separate people by all sorts of things. And I think that belonging is a tool for leaders to say, what do I want my people to belong to? Not to be a family. I think that's just, that language is not healthy in an organization. Right? We're not a family. We're people that come to work. But if we can belong to our work in a way that we have ownership of it, that we feel a sense of shared purpose, that we have a shared commitment to one another because we're all working toward a shared goal, that's magic for opening this sort of intrinsic motivation to come to work and be part of something that's special. And I think those are the kinds of things that leaders need to be looking for, not this sort of, how do I drive more productivity and get more widgets out of my folks? It's, how do I create an environment where people feel like this is where they want to be?
And that's where I saw you speak to this notion of moving away from designing workplaces and designing people places. And I really appreciated that. And then you go on to say these people places, a space and structure where employees come together to learn, collaborate, and get the needed resources to do the work that they do, either at home or some other place, which is a paradigm shift. And again, all three of us are working together to try to help equip the leaders of the future to do this. But I think even just saying that this is not a workplace, it's a people place is a great thing. And Chris, no surprise, what you just elucidated there, of course, takes what is happening in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and now belonging space to a whole other level. You just created something much bigger there than I've ever heard anybody actually articulate around the space of belonging. So thank you again for that brilliance.
Yeah, and since we wrote the book, Seth Godin's come out with a book called The Song of Significance.
Yes, I'm reading it now.
Yeah, and if you're in through the introduction part, he goes through the survey he did with 10,000 people in 90 countries on the best job they've ever had. And he gave them a pre-described list of things. So it was, it could have some cohesion to it. What I think is interesting is at the bottom of the list are the 10 things we tend to put at the top of a list when we're designing a job, which were, I got paid a lot, I got to travel, I got to tell people what to do, it wasn't difficult, and I got fired. Those are the bottom reasons. The top reasons are, I surprised myself with what I could accomplish, I could work independently, the team built something important, people treated me with respect. And really what we're talking about is people are looking for 4 things in work. They're looking for growth, they're looking for autonomy, they're looking for achievement, and they're looking for respect. And imagine the world we could live in if we designed jobs that way.
Right. Right. Well, and then to go on further, I thought this was really interesting too. You talk about Roger Martin's work as well, and this idea of organizing people not around jobs, but around projects. Really interesting. And that kind of, to me, spoke to something that I had some people on talking about the idea of holacracy, leading through holacracy. That was really interesting. Could you speak a bit more to this idea of organizing work around projects, but not jobs?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to work around jobs, and a job is a box that's generally defined by the last occupant. So it's filled with bias and irrelevant information, but we fill it. And by the time we fill a job, if you look at the speed of change and the time it can take to do that, most of what you're looking for is probably no longer relevant. So we end up with these people who are sort of misfit for the job we used to be searching for. So if we could attract people around a sense of agency, a sense of purpose, a sense of shared values, a desire to learn, a desire to grow, and then some fundamental skills and literacy so that they can enter the first few tasks you have them to do or first few projects. Then they can go on what Reid Hoffman called tours of duty, which is just another way of talking about some of the things that Roger talked about. And if you looked at things like management consulting firms or innovation strategy groups, people who are in them have a functional role, marketing, design, engineering, what have you, but they swarm to a project and they're on a project for a period of time. And I think most of our work is going to move more that way, especially when we hand off more and more to technology. We're going to have people in these collaborative explorations where you're going to go on tours and you're going to swarm to the project and then you're going to go back. You might be on the bench and do some learning and you'll swarm to the next project.
I love the way you describe that, Heather. It's so compelling. Let's let our listeners and viewers think on that for a second as we grab our last break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We're on the air with Heather McGowan and Chris Shipley, who are the authors of The Empathy Advantage, Leading the Empowered Workforce. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. I mentioned in the last break my latest book is called The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. I wrote that actually for leaders to be able to understand what's happening in the workforce, like Heather and Chris have been talking about as well. I also added an assessment on my website that you can actually go through and look and see to what extent is your leadership and culture meeting today's workforce. You can find it at alisecortez.com. All right, Heather and Chris, let's come back. We have just our last segment here, and I want to continue what you were saying there before the break, Heather. This idea of about the job descriptions, and you actually have a segment in there to fire the job description, which I think is great. And what I like about what you're putting forth instead of a job description is to the practice. You want to actually hire. Fill work around outstanding people instead. That is really, really compelling and definitely something on its side as well, or on its ear as well. How in the world could organizations actually start creating work and jobs around outstanding people?
I have to start by saying it's not easy.
Good.
Some organizations who've done it to some extent, it works better in smaller organizations or smaller divisions. It's hard to scale. Because it's so much easier in a large-scale organization to say this job does these tasks and fits under this person, and that's how you run it. But when you look at increasingly how we're going to be facing much more uncertainty, imperfect information, and rapid pivots, then it's really hard because you've got these people who know how to do certain tasks. What do you do when they're relevant? And I think we've proven that the spill and fill model doesn't really work. when you lay off large swaths of the workforce to hire new and shinier skills, you got a compression of enthusiasm and motivation and performance for some period of time, not just with the people who left, but the people who stay, who kind of wonder, one, am I next? And two, is this how they treat people? And, I'm not really motivated anymore. So we have to come up with a different way of retaining and repurposing people, because the organizations that repurpose people have higher levels of engagement and higher levels of performance.
Yeah, and just to reinforce what Heather was saying a moment ago about job descriptions, most job descriptions are written for the past, what we needed back then.
Right.
They're very traditional, right? We don't think about how do we hire people for what we don't even know we need yet. And so there, you're not hiring for specific skills necessarily. You might be hiring for a capacity to understand the world of marketing, or be an engineer, or certain skill sets writ large. But you're really wanting to investigate what is someone's capacity to learn, to collaborate, to be part of a team, to be okay with not knowing something and figuring it out. And those are not typical interview questions, right? But we have to reframe, what has this person done in the past? Great, that might be good for us in the future, because we don't know, right? To think about, what is this person's capacity to adapt and learn and to engage with our team to discover new opportunities.
Yeah, and on the if I can just grab onto that, I also think we need to do a far, far better job at internal mobility. We tend to think somebody externally is more valuable than somebody internally. And we don't look beyond the things that show up often on CVs and LinkedIn. Like, I remember I was working at a university, and there was somebody in the office in which I was working who I wanted to put on my team and elevate, who had not finished her degree yet. And universities have a lot of places have a bias about that. Certainly universities do, because that's the business they're in. But I also had discovered that she raised triplets, and that her husband was gone often for work. So she often raised triplets by herself.
Wow.
And I said, there's nothing that's going to come up that she can't handle better than any of us, regardless of our age.
Serious.
So I did end up eventually getting her on my team, and now she's at the in a senior leadership position at the university. But those are the kinds of things that we need to look for, particularly when it comes to women who often leave the workforce to raise their children, and then they come back at a lower rung on the ladder, where I think they should come back at a much higher level. Because if you've raised a human, and if you've raised more than one human at once, you are more than equipped to handle much of the stuff that comes up at work.
I love that, Heather. So really focusing on the full human, right, and all of his or her element is just so important.
Yes, that also goes for military experience as well.
Yep.
I mean, there's a lot of things that we're not looking closely enough for, because in this VUCA or BRAT RUPT world, there's all the new acronyms for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We need to look and tap into those skill sets that people develop in real time out of necessity.
Yeah, and I like how you're talking about really the new model in your book about this around work and jobs, et cetera. And I like how you're really focused on an outcome-focused collaboration among people of different and complementary skills who come together focused on a defined objective. And I think what I love also about that is that, again, we're moving away from that focus on presenteeism to productivity. And I know we need a better vehicle to deliver that for our leaders. And of course, like you, I'm out to support them too, because this is what we know, presenteeism. But I really appreciate that whole notion of outcome-focused collaboration. Can you speak a bit more to that?
Yeah, I mean, even if you look at this way outside the traditional bounds, I remember reading a study, and it was back in like the 90s, that looked at the efficiency of drug-based gangs and how they organized and operated in a way that was very efficient, more so than what you learn at Harvard Business School. So we sometimes have to look way out.
Who are we going to? Yeah.
Find models. And I wouldn't encourage that, because I think, I'm not encouraging illegal activity or some of the things that happen in those environments. But there's sort of an efficiency to things that we learn in extreme environments, whether it's the military, parent raising, or being in a gang.
Yeah, or even just being in the pressure of an organization that's continuously changing, which is what it's doing. And I think we talk about things like presenteeism and productivity, because these are things that we can measure. But we have a hard time really embracing the idea of what is really performance. What does it mean for our team to come together perform well, to achieve some goal together, to recognize an opportunity to go forward together when these new opportunities arise. So we need to find better metrics so that we can measure the things that matter.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. And I appreciate that, where all of us, and back to your point, Heather, early on, is being empathetic toward our leaders who are trying their best to steward this workforce, and helping them find their way is important. And even moving away from, what you also mentioned in your book, is moving away from the long tenured roles, the concept of lifetime employment, to shorter engagements, right? The idea that a project might require 2 to 3 years of concentrated effort. And this, to me, sounded an awful lot like what you see in, consulting companies. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of interesting to think about too. Could you speak to what that might look like in an organization to focus more on that sort of a concept?
Yeah, and I think this sort of brings back, the best language I have for it is the Reid Hoffman's concept of towards a duty. So it's not that you stay with an organization, because a lot of people can stay with one organization for a very long time, but move around to different projects in different divisions. And so I think the real focus there is, what are you learning? What are you contributing? Should you still be in this role? Is it time for you to move to another role? Are we continuing to develop your skills? Are we continuing to engage you? Because the models we had in the past were basically like, we took somebody, say they were an engineer or a salesperson, and if they were good at it, we elevated them out of the position they were good at into a position of management they may or may not have wanted to have. And we selected people, we often let people self-select based upon sometimes ego and insecurity. They felt better being the boss. And so we picked people who could, drive productivity a bit myopically, sometimes with domination, fear, or even humiliation. They can make, they could be unquestioned experts who can make decisions in certainty. And if you just look at those two sets of factors right now, they're liabilities, because most people are managing teams of people who have skills and knowledge that they do not. So they can't be an unquestioned expert making a decision in certainty. And a leader who is a little bit insecure and leads with that domination, fear, or even humiliation, that's going to backfire on this workforce, because this workforce is looking for people who are authentic and vulnerable, who trust them. Yeah. So the leadership profile, which has been wrong for a long time, really did a 180 out of necessity over the last couple of years.
Oh, so I again, that goes back to having empathy for those that are trying to actually steward these organizations. Yep. And we would be remiss if we didn't say a little bit more about this notion of hybrid work. I know that a lot of organizations and leaders are really struggling with that. And one of the things, again, that I appreciated about what you talk about in your book, and you mentioned Roger Marin again as well, but also you talked about this notion of what Mark Crowley said in May of 2022, a podcast interview, looking to actually create curated experiences for people. That I found incredibly compelling. One, I will say that one thing I've gotten from being in the pandemic is the importance that it seems to have emerged of a focus on experience as something really central for people. So providing what's the experience of actually being in the office. And so could you say a little something about this notion of curated experiences when it comes to hybrid, and how leaders can support that or steward that? Fascinating concept.
Yeah, too much of the hybrid work has been, again, counting things that we think we can count. How many times does somebody swipe into the building? How many hours are they there? You need to be there X number of days a week or a month. And, if your days are Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Monday, Friday, or Monday, Tuesday, Friday, whatever it may be, if you're on one of those 3-day rotations, if you go on the days that work for you, the day you can get childcare, or the way you can get elder care, or the way your spouse or partner can manage things. A lot of times I hear from folks, I'm going in on my required days, but I get there, I sit in a cubicle and I Zoom to people who are home.
Right.
It's not motivating. That's very demotivating. Mm-hmm. So curated experiences are, I went in and there was a reason for I went in. So a lot of the work that I do, I find myself more than conference speaking, although I do some of that, is going into organizations like this. Past Tuesday morning, I was in Vancouver. I spoke to 9 people. 9, not 90. I read the sheet and I was like, is that a typo? 90? No, it's 9. We want you to lead a conversation and have, an in-depth conversation where people can ask you anything. We're bringing people into a central location for them to have this experience. And I think, and it's not just about speakers, but you have to have something that's the gravity to get people there. What is the thing that you want them to do that they can't do from Zoom, that they're going to have some sort of experience, whether it's a learning experience, a collaborative experience, it's a brainstorming session. It's something that works better in person. I don't think culture is limited to in-person experiences. It helps, but I don't think it's limited to in-person experiences. Certainly you can develop culture and belonging remotely as well, but those in-person experiences have to have a moment of gravity. It gives us a reason to be there. So people walk away from it and say, that was worth fighting traffic. That was worth paying for daycare. That was worth, it was worth it.
Yeah. Yes. And we think about this in terms of when we come together, what's happening, how does leadership create an experience of that reason to be together? And that's absolutely true. I think, and this is where we really do need to have great empathy for people leading today, is we're moving from, I think, an idea of leading, meaning, often, this kind of command and control, here's the hill, let's go take it, to even kind of being coaching. We talk a lot about leaders now as coaches and mentors. I think they're moving into a role of being curators of the work, curators of the project, curators of the culture. And it doesn't matter whether that means people are in an office coming together for a purpose, like sitting down, having a great experience with Heather, or being at home, but being given the tools and resources they need, the access they need to do something different and special there. Curation now is leadership, or leadership is now curation. And that's a major mindset shift that is going to be really challenging for a lot of leaders. But those who can do it, I think, are going to find that their people are engaged, they feel trusted, they leverage their agency to work in a way that's far more beneficial, creates much more value for the organization.
Yeah, and if I could just jump on that, in addition to that, when you start looking at the technology tools that are emerging, like everyone's talking about ChatGPT and playing with it, when you start looking at what the human does in that role, it's prompt, curate, refine, make meaning, and then deploy at scale. Now, if you look at that, you're really looking at people who are getting better at collaboration and curation and refinement and prompting, whether it be in leadership or in the actual creation of the work that we do every day.
Well, and this is why I couldn't resist calling this episode, that leaders had been kicked upstairs. And I understand and empathize so deeply with how terrifying that must be. If you're running an organization, you're like, wow, I have now, there's an expectation that I need to be performing on this level, and with a whole other set of skills in this, it's like we're playing on Mars or whatever it is. And I really, really appreciate, admire, and I'm grateful and feel privileged that I get to, alongside you, get to help steward this place for our leaders and in the workplace of the future. It's incredibly compelling and gratifying work to get to do. So on that note, here we are at the close already. This show is listening to by people around the world that are trying to help create those workplaces where people can realize their potential. They're led by those inspirational, now curated leaders, and we do business that betters the world. What would you like to leave our listeners with?
I'd like to leave with the idea that we have not put forth. Now, we call the book The Empathy Advantage. People are like, well, how do I get started? I say, listen. If you look at your head, you have 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, and 2 ears. There's only one output device. The others are input devices, and that's how we should be looking at communication. If you really want to help and understand your people, really try to listen, understand where they're coming from, and help them become the next best version of themselves.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think we often see empathy as something leaders should have for their people. I would like leaders to start with self-empathy. Understand that this is a really challenging place that you're in. You're not going to be brilliant at this from the get-go. You're finding new ways to be and lead and curate your workforce, and that's hard. And so give yourself a break. Give yourself the opportunity to make some mistakes and learn from them. Work closely with your people to understand what is working, what's not working, how you can change and adapt. But start with a level of self-empathy that allows you to give yourself the latitude to figure this stuff out.
Great way to finish, both of you. Heather, Chris, I'm delighted to know you both. As you know, I read your book cover to cover, which is what I do with each of the books, and you really have created something profoundly important. I'm very happy to share with my listeners across the world. Thank you for being on Working on Purpose.
Thanks so much for having us.
You're welcome. Listeners and viewers, I highly encourage you to get in touch with either of these ladies or both of them. If you want to learn more about Heather McGowan, you can go to her website, which is heathermcgowan.com. Let me spell that for you. Heather, Heather, and then McGowan, McGowan, heathermcgowan.com. And for Chris Shipley, you can go to cshipley.com. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on the air with Robert Lingell talking about his new book, A Place for Tea, Giving Voice to the Tortoise on Our Harebrained World, which addresses the busyness that stresses relationships, kills spirit and trust in the workplace, and silences the voices of dissent that would otherwise break down communication. Next week, we'll be on the air with Atiq Rafiq talking about his book, Decision Sprint, the new way to innovate into the unknown and move from strategy to action. See you there. And remember that work is an integral and important part of our lives. It can be one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.